Hello, today is November 28th, 1994, and my name is Dan Cruz, and I am a volunteer with the Illinois Historical Society, which is cooperating with a statewide effort to collect oral histories from Illinois citizens that participated in the events surrounding World War II. We are in the home of Bill Tingley, who lives at, Bill, could you have your address?
715 North 7th Street, Marshall, Illinois.
Well, Mr. Tingley served in the branch of the United States Armed Forces during World War II, and we are interviewing him about his experiences in that war. Bill, would you please start by introducing yourself to me, please?
I'm Bill Tingley,
Okay.
Marshall, Illinois.
All right, and can I have your date of birth?
November the 28th, 1917.
So we're talking to you today on your birthday.
That's right.
Well, happy birthday, Bill. We would also like to have the names of each of your parents.
My father was Harry Tingley, and my mother was Alice Tingley.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
2 sisters and 3 brothers. One sister is Jane Abel, lives at Bridgeport, Illinois, and Jean and Guy and Carl are brothers, all live around Marshall. And my youngest sister, Mary, is married to Bill McGee, and they live in Utah.
Well, are there any details about your parents or your family that you would like to give that I could put on this tape? Anything specific that stands out in your mind, Bill?
Well, of course, my folks were always farmers. They probably were one of the few that had 4 sons in the Army during World War II, all at the same time.
Well, Bill, we're going to start the interview, and this is the portion of this interview is you entering the military service and during the war years. Tell me, Bill, what was it like for you before the war, specifically during 1941?
Well, at that time I lived here in Marshall with my grandmother and most of the time, and I ran a service station here in town.
Well, what thoughts did you have about the war before the United States became directly involved?
Well, I guess I always just thought if we got involved, why, I'd do my part if I was asked to.
Did you hear the December 7th, 1941 radio announcement about the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese?
Yes, I did.
And what were you doing at that time? Do you remember?
I happened to be in Chicago that day, and took my brother Guy up there. He was going to work in a airplane factory.
Do you remember what your reaction was, and maybe those around you at the time that you heard the message?
Well, I don't think I realized that we would get as much involved as we did, just from what I heard that day, although it was alarming news.
Had you formed any prior opinion or developed any feelings about what had been taking place in Europe or Asia at this time?
Well, of course, I always thought what Hitler was doing in Europe was going to end up a tragedy someday that somebody would have to straighten out.
Well, do you ever recall reading any newspaper accounts of the German aggression in Europe?
Yes, I read a lot of them.
And did you have any knowledge of Hitler's speeches or ideas or his actions at this time?
I knew that he was, running over people that he shouldn't be running over.
Did something that I haven't asked other people who lived in Clark County, but I don't know, there probably was a number of radio stations that were probably coming from Terre Haute at that time. Did they carry any of the speeches that he gave, or just excerpts or anything like that? Do you remember any of that?
Probably just excerpts on the news, or I don't remember listening to any complete speech. No.
Well, what events led to your entry into military service? You weren't. Were you already in the service, or were you drafted, or did you volunteer?
Well, I did volunteer. Wayne Tingley and I had already got our notices, though, that our numbers had been drawn in the draft and that we were to report for our physicals and would be called before too long. And we had this idea that if we enlisted, maybe we could get into the branch that we wanted in, or something like that, you know.
Mm-hmm. When and where were you inducted into the military?
I was enlisted at Mattoon, Illinois, and was inducted at Scott Field down there in Belleville.
Okay. Now you were in the United States Army, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And do you have any special memories of when you were inducted?
Well, I remember that Wayne and I were together, and so when we got our orders after we'd taken our exams, you know, IQs and mechanical aptitude and so on, why I was going to go to Shepherd Field, Texas, and Wayne was listed to go to Fort Lewis, Washington. So we went in and asked the commanding officer there if it would be possible if we could go together to take our basic training. And so he got both of our papers together and looked at them a little bit, and he says, yeah, I guess we can arrange that. So we both went to Fort Lewis, Washington.
How old were you when you went to Fort Lewis?
23.
And after, I guess I'm backing up and repeating a little bit what I said earlier, but what happened after you were inducted? Do you have any specific memories about that?
Well, I think it was just within 2 or 3 days they had us on troop trains and headed towards Fort Lewis, Washington for our basic training.
Right, so you went there by train.
Mm-hmm.
At Fort Lewis, what were you trained to do?
Well, just basic training as an infantryman, ground services.
Well, what did you think of the training?
As far as I knew, it was like we usually done it. I guess I was satisfied with it.
Or was it pretty tough training? And do you remember how many weeks it was?
That was about 8 weeks.
8 weeks. Did anything special happen there that stands out in your mind at Fort Lewis?
Well, no, not really. After our basic training was over, why? And then the division that we were in stayed there around that area for quite a while, and we done. We were in what they call the Western Defense Command, and we done like outposts and beach patrol on the Pacific Ocean and all the way up and down the Oregon and Washington coast, and we guarded all military bases like airports. They kept guards on airplanes and everything every night.
Mm-hmm. Well, what division were you in?
44th Infantry Division.
44th Infantry Division. Did you attend any other training camps?
Well, not the first year or year and a half. In fact, 2 or 3 months probably after no longer than that, about 6 months after we were there, where they broke our division up and sent most of the men now as replacements in other divisions, but they kept a cadre there to replace trainees that came in, and I was part of that cadre then for about a year and a half. And they'd be groups come in, and we'd give them their 2 or 3 months, and then they'd leave, and another group would come in.
The 44th Division, was that assigned to any particular army, like the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Army? Do you remember?
Not that I know of then.
Okay.
They were old. They were the New Jersey National Guard prior to being federalized and sent out there.
Where did you go after completing your basic training?
We still stayed in Fort Lewis was our headquarters. we weren't there a lot of the time. We were out on these different missions, at different times. But then part of the time we were there as a training cadre.
Now, was there much talk at that time about the possibility of either the Japanese coming to the West Coast or anything like that? Do you remember?
Well, it made us think that was always a possibility, They had blackouts of night for so many miles in from the coast, and cities along the coast were blacked out of the night. And like I said, they had beach patrol and outposts and everything in case the Japanese did try to make a landing there somewhere.
When were you sent overseas, and how did you get there?
I went overseas, and not until probably last of January, 1st of February of 1945. But what happened in between the time that we're just talking about and then, sometime in early part of 44, they called a bunch of us out and told us that we had test scores good enough that if we'd like to go to the Air Force, why we could have that opportunity. So I was getting a little tired of the West Coast by that time, so I wasn't all that enthused about flying, but I did sign up to go, and they did send me down to Shepherd Field, Texas then, and we went through tests and everything. But at that time, if you were going to be a pilot or a navigator or bombardier, one of those, and you hadn't been to college, you had to go to a college training detachment for about 6 months. So they sent me to Coe College in Iowa, and I spent the 6 months there. I'd already had my orders to go to California for pre-flight, but during the last days of our time there, they called a group of us out again and told us that orders had just come through that all men that had come from the ground forces to the Air Force and hadn't yet reached pre-flight would have to go back to the ground forces. So at that time, they sent me down to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and I joined the 97th Division, 387th Infantry 97th Division. And we ran maneuvers there and things that summer, and then fall went to the West Coast, and we were at a Marine camp out there, and they'd take us out on ships, and we'd go down rope ladders and things like that, and get in PT boats and make beach landings, and getting trained to go to the Pacific Ocean to fight the Japs. Well, then along about December that fall was you remember they had the Battle of the Bulge over in Europe. Well, this 97th Division was declared combat ready, but Ike still had priority, so he called for a couple more divisions, and so we were sent to Europe, even though we'd been training the last 6 months to go to Japan.
How did you get over to Europe? Did you go by ship?
Went by ship.
Yep. And where did you depart from?
Kilmer, New Jersey. Camp Kilmer, New Jersey.
So you're on the West Coast training there, and then you go to. How long did it take you to get from the West Coast to the West Coast to the East Coast, and then get to Germany? Do you remember a time frame there?
Well, I'd say after we got our orders that we were going over there, they did give us all a leave of about 3 weeks. I think I was home for Christmas in '44, and then reported back to California, and then they shipped the whole division out by rail across the country to Kilmer, New Jersey, and then we were on the ocean just a little less than 2 weeks. It was January. It was real rough. It was a small ship, and it was a real rough trip. Most people were sick most of the way over.
Was it a military ship, or was it, like, say, just a private type
It was a
vessel?
military ship. Troop.
Was-
Made especially to carry troops.
Was there any talk at that time about submarines in the Atlantic?
There was still some talk about it. We went over in a convoy. We, I think soon after that, ships went to going individually more than in convoy.
Do you remember anything about the convoy, of watching it, or anything that impressed you or stands out in your mind?
Yeah, I'd get out on deck once in a while, and like I said, it was real rough, and you'd go up and down over waves and go clear down in where you couldn't see ships, and then bob back up and you could see them out there, I don't remember how many were in the convoy.
When did you arrive in Europe, and where did you land?
We landed in France, Le Havre, France. That was a port city on.
Right. And what did you think of the United States war efforts up to this point?
Well, it was always amazing how they put all this together in 3 or 4 years and begin to accomplish the things by that time that they were doing.
Yeah, I agree with it. I always think it's kind of overwhelming when you start thinking about that.
That's right. And when you got over there, you begin to see that it was a pretty big thing, After we landed, we probably took a week or two to get the division completely outfitted, with equipment, trucks, and all that kind of thing.
What type of weapons were you working with at this time? And, were you assigned to a rifle company, or?
I was just, a platoon sergeant in a rifle company.
What type of weapon did you carry?
Well, a platoon sergeant could. Really, the regular issue was carbine, But after we got up where there was action, why most of us threw that away and got an M30, like the rest of the guys did in the squad, platoon.
If you did not immediately enter a combat zone, when did you go? Where did you go? Excuse me. Where did you go before entering combat?
Well, after we got equipped in France, why we started moving over towards. When we went into combat, it was getting up near the Rhine River, just about across the river from Dusseldorf. Mm-hmm. They had a thing they called the Ruhr Pocket. Mm-hmm. The Germans had been surrounded, but they hadn't surrendered yet. And so we relieved another division. They hadn't quite reached the Rhine River.
Well, tell us about your experience of entering your first combat zone. What was your reaction to that, and maybe your thoughts about that?
Well, of course, after we got to the combat zone, we didn't go around like a bunch of scared sheep all the time or anything like that, but then you soon realized that it was a real thing. The worst thing we had to put up with when we first got up there was the Germans were gradually pulling back. They'd stop and put up resistance for a while and then pull back some, but the thing that was the most devastating was German 88s. Their artillery was, the German artillery was probably the best there ever was.
Can you list for us in order of occurrence all the combat action in which you were involved, or the areas? You mentioned the Ruhr Pocket. I have read a number of histories about that. What did you know at that time about the Ruhr Pocket? And I would also be really interested to know, did Did you see very many prisoners at this, or I should say German prisoners at this time, or what type of troops did you know that you were up against?
We didn't see too many troops at that time. We did finally work on up to the Rhine River, and I remember one night there had been a squad out of our company, went across the river and engineer boats as a patrol, you know. The Army's theory was never let the Army rest, and at the same time you wanted to be finding out what you could about them, so they sent this patrol across one night, and of course any of those came back. And a couple nights later I was supposed to go across with my whole platoon, and so they brought up the engineer boats and right after dark and got them in the water, and we were in 2 or 3 German houses there close by, and we were supposed to move out about 11 o'clock, and I think that's one time that divine providence intercepted, and because you know there really wasn't much chance to go across and get back. But about we were supposed to get ready to leave about 11 o'clock that night, and about 10:30 the runner came around from the company and said that the patrol had been called off. Found out the next morning the reason it was because our unit was going to be pulled off the line and moved, so
it was
we
kind
were
of
saved from that.
a big sigh of relief at that point.
That's right.
Do you have any recollection of, like, say, interacting with, like, say, German civilians at this time, and expand upon that, of what the people were like that you met?
Well, the German people, the civilians were nice people, and we did have a boy in our company that spoke German very fluently, and so we could communicate with them whenever we wanted to. Of course, in Germany, if you had a chance to be on break or relief a little, say of a night, well, you always just went into German houses and told the people to get out, and we'd take over the house for the night. And so we did that sometimes. Now, when we were up there with the rear pocket, we were in Hodge's 1st Army. And as the pocket got smaller, I guess they could pull some units off, and they did pull us off after about 40 days or something like that. And we went back and then went south and crossed the Rhine River at Cologne, and went farther south and joined the 3rd Army, which was under Patton, General Patton. And he was making a push across southern Germany and towards Czechoslovakia.
Did your mental attitude change at all as combat continued?
I would say not.
Did you, when you had those moments of rest and maybe relaxation and maybe a little time on your hands, did you write many letters home?
Yes, I wrote letters home regularly.
Did you receive many letters or packages from family, and if so, how often did you get mail from home?
Well, I can remember at least 2 or 3 times going as much as 3 weeks without getting any mail, but then you'd get a whole packet of it.
What types of things did you get in, like, say, packages from home, do you remember?
Well, after we got over there, and of course that was after Christmas and everything, I don't remember getting many packages of eats, but mostly letters.
Did you forge close bonds or friendships with many of the men that you were your combat companions?
Well, yeah, I still correspond with a few of them. Of course, you realize when you got in combat, why people that were in your unit changed pretty fast sometimes. But there were probably 8 or 10 in our platoon that went all the way through Germany and then came back and later on went to Japan.
Well,
and we stayed together till the end of the war.
During your combat duty, did you ever capture any enemy prisoners? And if you did, or please explain maybe some of the circumstances surrounding it.
Well, on this campaign through southern Germany, most of the time there was some Germans surrendered, but on the next to the last day before the war ended, we started out early that morning about maybe 4 o'clock, and our unit walked down a blacktop road, I remember, and one column on each side of the road spread out quite a bit. It wasn't long till Germans started coming from the other way. They were coming about 4 abreast down the center of the road. A whole division or something surrendered, and they wanted to come towards the Americans instead of going towards the Japs. Our destination that morning was, the company commander said that Pilsen, Czechoslovakia was 52 miles away, and that's where we're supposed to meet the Russians.
And did you meet the Russians? Is that where you were?
All day, well, like I said, all day the Germans was coming the opposite direction, surrendering, and they were old men and 14-year-old boys, and their uniforms were pretty tattered. You could tell they'd been beaten all right. And well, then that day the word began to come through that Germany had surrendered. And when we stopped that night, it was after dark, and I got the report then that we were 12 miles out of Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. So we traveled about 40 miles that day, but we never did go on into Pilsen, no.
What was the reaction of all the fellows around you at the time that you learned that Germany had surrendered?
I guess a great relief would be the best way to describe it. Of course, like I said, in Germany itself, when we had time to rest, well, we went in German homes, but just as soon as the war was over, well, that was over with. And like when we were in France, we didn't stay in people's homes then. We bivouacked or whatever. But the day after the war ended, we set up camp in the woods there, I remember, and we're there for 2 or 3 days. I remember one night it rained all night. Water got to running through under the pup tents, and some of us finally put our raincoats on and stood up most of the night out under a tree there. But then, just within a few days, or maybe less than a week, they began to load us on some troop trains that they'd got together, and since our division was one of the last full divisions to go to Europe, why we were one of the first ones back out, the whole division. And so they took us back to France. And then we back across the Atlantic Ocean, and when we got to the United States, we got a 30-day leave, and that was in August. And the war ended in May in Europe.
Well, when you were in Europe, like I said, prior to the end of the war, were you aware of any of the concentration camps and their existence, and maybe explain a little bit how you learned about them, and how much did you know at that time?
Really, I never was near the concentration camps. I think, you know, we probably missed those by going that southern route. Of course, I know they existed and so on, but I never did visit one or see one.
This probably sounds somewhat of a strange question, but what was the highlight occurrence, memorable experience of your combat experience? Do you have one, Bill?
Well, like I said before, it's just kind of amazing how they could put together a war like a machine like that in such a few years and accomplish what they did accomplish. Of course, it was, after it was over with, you were glad you got to see places like Germany and the Autobahn highways, and you could tell at one time Germany had been a prosperous place.
What do you remember of how Germany looked when you were there as a soldier? Was it devastation all over, or what kind of things did you experience and see?
Well, the rural area mostly was, you know, it wasn't tore up too bad. You see the nice little farms that the German people had, and most of them in southern Germany there lived in the small villages, but they would own 30 to 60 acres or something out in the country, and they'd go out there in the daytime and farm and
Well, coming from a farm yourself here in central Illinois, back at that time, did you have a chance to talk with like any farmers and then, kind of thing, and did you compare stories or at least strike up any kind of conversations to that manner?
Yeah, I talked to a few of them. Of course, it was different farming there than it was here. They didn't raise corn or soybeans as a commercial crop like we did. They all had some livestock. They all raised a lot of truck of their own, and then they raised wheat and had sheep. This was in southern Germany, sort of the Black Forest that came up from Italy, or you know. So.
Well, tell us what you and the other men did to celebrate, like, say, America's traditional holidays, like, say, Thanksgiving and Christmas. Do you have any memories about this? I know you mentioned earlier that you were home Christmas of 1944. Was your group ever together celebrating any of these holidays?
No, I don't think so. I was just over there about 4 months, and that was after the first year, and I just don't remember celebrating any holidays.
Well, when and how did you return to the United States after the end of the war in Europe?
Well, like I said, they began to get railroads fixed right away where they were blowing out and everything, and they got a troop train lined up, and that's what we got on that troop train, and it was more like just sitting in freight cars or flat cars that we sat in and came back on to France, and then again we got on a ship and crossed the Atlantic back to New Jersey.
Through another troop ship. Yeah.
Through another troop ship. Yeah.
Well, what happened when you arrived back in the United States?
Well, we all got a 30-day leave as soon as we got back. That was given to us right from the point of embarkation. Mm-hmm. And then after we had our 30-day leave, well, the whole division rejoined back in Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
And Were you given any specific instructions at Fort Bragg? Where I know there were things were still going on over in the Pacific. Were they planning to send your unit over that way?
We just knew all the time where we were going when we got back. You know, it seemed to me like we're at Fort Bragg maybe probably not over 2 or 3 weeks, and then troop trains again all the way to Bremerton, Washington. And from there we left across the Pacific on it was a much larger ship this time than it had been in the Atlantic, and of course the Pacific was quieter anyway, so it was a lot better boat ride.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, tell me about your military rank and maybe any decorations or campaign decorations you might have received.
Well, I was a technical sergeant, which was a platoon sergeant in the rifle company. I had that rank, I guess, before I ever went to Europe, and stayed with that rank the rest of the time through the Army. Did receive 1 Bronze Star from that campaign in Southern Europe. Outside of that, just good contact ribbons and your theater ribbons, you know, in Europe and eventually Asia, and the United States Defense Command, 3 or 4 of them.
Did you retain all your military decorations?
Yes.
After the war, you're back and you're settling into civilian life. How did you get along with the men with whom you had the greatest contact, the ones you served with? Tell me about the relationship that you had maybe with any of them.
There was, about 4 of them that I corresponded with for quite a while. There was one fellow from Michigan, his name was Beretta, that stopped by to visit a couple times, and Lieutenant Anderson was my platoon commander when I left. I visited Marshall once, and I had a good friend in Chicago that we have met, and he had about 15 guys there that time, about 3 years ago. We had a reunion up there. It's really the only one I've been to since I got home.
Were there things that you would do differently if you could do them once again?
Well, I don't really know many things I could have done different.
Let's say, what was the most difficult thing you had to do during your period of military service? You remember that?
Well, I suppose when you roll in combat or in Germany, why, there was a few times when you had to tell some people to do some things that you didn't like to, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there any one thing that stands out as your most successful achievement in military service?
I guess I always felt like I got along with people good and they respected me.
Well, how did you learn about VJ Day and what was your reaction to it?
Well, VJ Day, we were on, when we left Bremerton, Washington, we were supposed to go to Cebu in the Philippines and join up with Kruger's 6th Army, and that's the army that was going to make the invasion into Japan.
Mm-hmm.
But while we were going across the Pacific was when the treaty was signed on Missouri with MacArthur and the Japanese, and that ended the war. So actually, we were on the ship for about 30 days at that time. We went down towards or down to the island of Cebu, but we never did unload. They got us in a convoy after they got equipment and everything ahead of us, and we went right on into Yokohama, Japan for occupation.
Well, what was your opinion of the use of the atomic bomb when it was dropped in Japan in August of 1945?
Well, I guess I was glad for it because I knew it was going to end the war.
Has that opinion changed in the last 50 years?
Well, I've had some thoughts about it, you know. Killing that many civilians in one spot. Is that bomb someday still going to come back to haunt us, you know? If somebody drops one on our country sometime. Yeah, I've thought about it.
When and where were you officially discharged from the service?
Jefferson Barracks, Missouri.
Do you have any opinions or feelings about our nation's military status or its policies today, maybe, and compared to how they were when you got out of the military in 1946?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
February 1946.
Well, do you have any contact with Veterans Administration?
No, not anymore.
And what is your opinion of the VA, and have you ever gone to a VA hospital for medical services?
No, I never have. I belong to the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars here in town, but I'm not a real active member.
How did your experiences during World War II affect your life since that time?
I don't know that it had a lot of effect on it, except it prolonged everything for about 4 years, you know.
Well, do you feel your wartime contribution to the nation has been appreciated?
Well, I always felt that it was, as much as it should be.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you for cooperating with this project, and I appreciate your time answering these questions.
Glad to do it.